Move to the panel discussion. I would like to ask Barry and Kelly, Michael, and myself. Okay, so you can ask any questions you want to any of us. Yeah, sure.
I have a question for Michael Gorin. You presented at the beginning of your talk a number of rather critical issues about non-nutritive sweeteners and their effects on adiposity. In adults, we've done similar studies, and when we control through the interaction and the modification of diet, we find, the Big Mac, unhealthy eater. When we control for that, we lose the effect, or in fact, we get a positive benefit on lots of different outcomes. And it's been shown in both the health professionals, nurses studies, and in cardia. We've reversed findings that ignored diet of the women or men. In your studies, did you look at the interaction between the diet and what you were doing, or were these really unadjusted studies for this profound interaction between healthy eating and diet sweetener consumption and unhealthy eating and diet sweetener consumption? Because in the US, we have two groups of people: the unhealthy eaters that consume a lot of diet beverages as a rationale, and the other. And I ask it because globally, the issue of diet sweeteners, it's expanding in our beverage supply very rapidly, and soon in our food supply, because of the sugar concern. So it's a very critical public health issue.
Great. I thought you were going to, is this on? I thought you were going to ask me a really hard question, like what's going to happen with Brexit or something. No, that's a really tough question. I expect we'll be hearing a lot more of that tomorrow. I don't think we have as good data, unfortunately, in children to be able yet to break those apart. We certainly don't have it in our studies, but I think you're asking about the bigger studies.
And also the pregnancy studies.
The problem is these studies do a lot of great things, but most of them don't do diet good. So, for example, I was asking a very similar question to the people who did the Canadian study, and they don't have the best measures, unfortunately, of maternal diet, certainly not repeated measures during pregnancy and postpartum. So I think it's very hard to have a study that does it well all the way through the different stages of development, so you can really tease them apart. Does that answer?
Question for Dr. Popkin. I'm just wondering what's the difference in the political and social climate in Chile that permitted for such comprehensive changes to be made in marketing and advertising of food?
Yes, it's very interesting. Chile did this without major advocacy. So it was done not by having, like in Mexico or Berkeley or all across this country and the world, where you've had really huge public health and advocacy pushes for many years before you got it. In the case of Chile, first they had a minister of health who was a pediatrician and really cared, and they had a physician in the government, in the Senate, who created a coalition of congressmen and senators who truly cared about diabetes and child obesity. Then that minister of health became president. And so the combination of a concern really by a huge coalition in Congress, some academics who had started pushing on this, global academics as well as some leaders in the country, and the Ministry of Health becoming president, and it created a grouping between their Congress, academia, and the leadership in the government that led to this cluster of laws. There was enormous pushback from industry. There were dozens of legal suits and claims and other kind of things, not unlike what Israel faced more recently, but because they treated all foods and beverages equally, imported, exported, whatever, they fought all those off. And so the industry, which did really try hard to fight them, really didn't have, there was such a strong coalition of advocates in Congress, senators and congressmen, that that's really what did it, plus the government that cared, and academics that were globally from the country who were providing really information that they listened to. No wrong facts.
Before we have the audience ask a question, I have a follow-up question for both of you related to the food policies. The trade war has the potential to disrupt the food systems globally, and how that's going to affect the food policies both in the U.S. and globally, and how that's going to affect the health-related outcomes.
There's two parts of that trade war. There's the part I mentioned with NAFTA, with our U.S. government putting into a lot of the trade negotiations things to help the food industry counter public health activities, and you can't imagine how much of that is going on. I only gave a couple examples that we know about. We're learning of new ones each day. The other part is what you're speaking of, and that it's such a big unknown in what it's going to do to the food supply globally and in the U.S. that impossible to predict from day to day.
No, I
Well,
agree.
you are now directing the Global Food Policy Center, so you may have a magical ball.
Well, it's hard to know where these trade wars are going to go because they're relatively new, but so we'll have to see how that plays out. But these trade decisions and trade actions have an enormous impact on the food supply. Like this is an example, I was talking to an economist from the World Bank who was discussing trade decisions China had made to meet their increasing meat consumption needs. And what he said is that China has very specifically made the decision not to import grains to raise the animals in China, but to have the animals raised in other countries, Brazil, Argentina, and the U.S., and have the meat imported to China, basically to externalize the environmental consequences of meat production so that all those countries are bearing the antibiotic resistance, the water, the climate change things. So it makes it easier for China to meet its environmental goals in that single trade decision. So these trade decisions are having an enormous impact, not only on the nutrition things we were talking about today, but on food systems in general. But not enough people are paying attention to that. So it'd be nice to have more scholarship to document those impacts.
Thank you. This is a question for Dr. Brunel. This pushback in the US of the FDA labeling of added sugars from 2018 to 2020 and 2021, that's a concern to me, and I'm wondering if it's a concern to you, and whether we can do anything to preempt further delays that I imagine industry is going to try and push for. In your preemption policy, and thoughts about how to counteract that potential.
Well, I remember meeting with the FDA planning things before we knew who was going to be elected. And we had very different plans for front of the package profiling, for doing the added sugar right away, and so forth. So essentially, we've had a pushback already of 3 to 5 years, depending on what's going on the labeling. And the fact that we're actually moving ahead on some minor things right now is even surprising that they're doing. But these pushbacks are going to continue. Believe me, it's...
And so what can we do in terms of policy to try and counteract that? That's what I was
you mean,
asking.
we're actually studying that and actually start measuring the amount of added sugar in our food supply and what will, and in the commercial food supply, and studying that. My research group is on the U.S. work. So, but what can we do to change it? That's not simple, as you can imagine, and there are a lot of people trying to change it, and we're And we lost, they're trying to use another approach called using the term healthy to try to find a way around some of these issues, to define a healthy diet and to make healthy be an all-encompassing word that would be the kind of healthy diet that Frank showed, the whole grains, et cetera. So define foods that are going to be defined as healthy, not by one nutrient, you have more vitamin C, but the combination of what we would call a healthy food. So the FDA's nutrition people are trying. It's not an easy time, but they are going to, the hearing's coming up in a few weeks on healthy, the term, are actually about them trying to use, because they can't do a front of the package profiling to get at healthy, they're going to try to use that term as a way to get at a kind of a healthier food profile for an individual food. So they're trying to do their best in a very complex environment.
Yeah, and I would just add to that that, first of all, not to get discouraged, because I think we're in a downtime now with some of the things happening at the federal level. But I think the overall trends toward more and more activism in the nutrition space are clear, and I think those will continue, and we just have to put up with this blip that's occurring during the current administration. And also, this wouldn't apply to labeling, but to many things, I think we're going to see the greatest action occurring at state and local levels, and that's a place where you really can make a difference when the federal government's doing such regressive things.
And one more point on that, of course, what happens globally will come back to affect us. And if we're gaining knowledge from other countries like we are, or seem to be, that things that truly work, we'll be in a position at some point to start pushing those. And we may have actually pushed the wrong policies if we had done some of the things now compared to what we learned in a few years. So, and our neighbors to the north, Canada, are doing some really strong labeling. They're going to do a warning label, a modified, watered-down version of Chile. They're doing a number of other things. So Canada is also going to be impacting us by what we learned from there.
Yes.
I have a question for Dr. Gorin. You mentioned in your talk that saccharin, sucralose, and acesulfame K were found in breast milk in some of the studies you cited. What do we know about some of the other sweeteners, such as ribadioside, aspartame, and some of the others? Are they found in breast milk also? Do we know?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I recall that aspartame was not, and I don't think they looked at the steviol compounds.
Okay, thank you.
Steve?
First of all, I wanted to thank you all for really excellent talks, and thank you very much. I have just two questions. First one, Michael. What do we know about the effects of fructose? We know that it affects insulin resistance and weight gain, but what do we know about its effects on the gut per se in terms of immunosurveillance, microbial translocation, gut leakiness, inflammation? What are the effects of that on the gut, fructose?
Yeah, great question. So we do know, again, mostly from animal studies, for example, fructose in the gut can promote gut bacterial translocation from the gut to the systemic circulation to the liver, and that's been shown in various models. So that's first. Second, I think, Frank introduced this issue of different sources of fructose, and I think we got to start thinking perhaps about some kind of fructose index as well, because I think a lot of these effects are dependent on not just the amount of fructose, but whether it's free fructose and how quickly it is coming into the